Dear class, welcome back to American National Government. Let's look at stages of federalism. So the stages that I'm going to talk about here, we kind of covered in another lecture, some of them, and we'll talk about some other ones in more detail. We talked about dual federalism, the period that is 1790s to 1880s, cooperative federalism, that is 1930s to 1970, new federalism, 1980s, basically. So classification, how do we classify these? Basically, these are classified based on the level of federal funding to state governments. And two, the reach of the federal government into reserve power of states. But you can also talk about the scale of federal government activity as well. What did that look like? And we'll talk a little bit about that. So, dual federalism. Dual federalism in the US is from 1790s to 1880s. Each part of government is exactly separate in power from the states, meaning that when it comes to state and federal, each part of government is equal. Under such conditions, how does one hold the other accountable? And we talked about that, right? There at some point, there has to be a confusion or sharing and overlapping going on. Okay, so federal government values at that time were, okay, there's such a thing as a welfare clause, but how we envision welfare is don't bother the states, right? Welfare has to do with free market competition, keep government out of industry, protect labor, not yet, right? We're kind of not very protective of labor at this point. So the US Congress pushes back in the 1880s, 1930s, but states put up a fight. And we talked about this in a previous lecture on federalism. So the US Congress is saying, look, we have problems in the economy. There is actually no free market. We have too many monopolies and there's no competition. And labor is being super exploited. And so they passed certain laws and we saw that, right? In the era of cooperative federalism, we get the New Deal. It starts with the New Deal. 1930s to 1960s, right? Congress expands its welfare clause. Finally, the federal government is saying, you know what? You have reserve power states and you were supposed to take care of regulating business, but you didn't. And so now we have to do something because look what happened. We had the stock market crash of the 1920s. We had the Great Depression. We just can't sit back anymore. So at this time, the federal government infringed on the reserved powers of states. Since the 1940s, welfare of the people also came under the federal government, as I just mentioned, when it came to administering health, safety, income security, education, and welfare to state residents, right? This was the absolute necessity of the time. So states, because they started to get so much money from the federal government, the purse had opened up, right? So the states backed down. They did not put up a fight because they needed the money. Funding to states. So we see a gradual increase in federal funding for state governments. In the 60s and 70s, we saw large block grants, meaning no strings attached. Large sums of money were just given to state governments, and they were told, do what you need to do with this money. Categorical grants had strings attached. So sometimes the federal government wanted to do certain things, and they gave the money and they said, this can only be applied to this category of things. So you can only spend on, say, education. Otherwise, we're taking the money back. You cannot spend it on anything else. With more money came more oversight by the federal government, right? So all this categorical grants, strings attached. And of course, this large amount of money also helped to end segregation because now the state governments needed the money and they allowed the federal government to help. So we see some kinds of reform happening, such as school busing reforms, right? We ended segregation, ended segregated schooling, and now we're going to have a system where everyone can go to school together, irrespective of race or ethnicity. So Lyndon Johnson's era as president is really important. We see an increase in the funding for public schools from K to 12. They also created the lunch program that you have in schools, right? So that is due to Lyndon Johnson's initiative. You have the creation of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. You have the Higher Education Act in 1965, the Elementary and Secondary School Act, and the Head Start preschool program in 1965. So now you have a lot of money to create public schools for higher education, for preschool programs, and suddenly we have created the type of society that we have become used to right now, right? Good public schools, or rather the creation of public schools, well-funded colleges and universities that are, publicly funded. And of course, we have preschool programs now, right? We also have free lunch, even in the summer in public schools in some places. Environmentalism. But also not just environmentalism, various kinds of issues came up. For example, the Highway Safety Act is not about environmentalism. It has to do with security, national security. So that was created so that when there's an attack by, say, Soviet Union or any country, then people could evacuate their cities. Clean Air Act has to do with environmentalism. Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, I think that has to do with food, nutrition, health, all of that, right? So President Nixon, who is a Republican, actually is responsible for creating the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, that the Republicans today greatly oppose, ironically. So we see all kinds of things happening at the federal level. So the cooperative federalism is not just when money comes into the process, but not only does money come in, but the federal government is allowed to do many things that will infringe on the reserved rights, because the reserve power of states has to do with managing the populations within states. But what is the nation if not 50 states, right? So the national government had to infringe, and it got away with it because it was giving so much money to the states, right? So the states are just quiet. Of course, they put up a fight once in a while, but they're generally appeased. They're happy. So they sort of join the bandwagon instead of trying to fight it. So while this is happening, foreign affairs wise, these characters end up getting a lot of bad publicity. Both are involved in sending troops to Vietnam. Nixon wants to reduce troops, so he ends up bombing Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam with napalm. It becomes a very bad situation. They're dropping bombs on civilians in villages and cities. And of course, the US government also ends up engaging in nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific Ocean and causes a lot of environmental damage, but also results in the uprooting of the Marshallese people. So I will post a video about this later when we talk about foreign policy. Right now, here we are with reserve powers. You see that the federal government starts to challenge reserve power of states on voting, on schooling, on marriage, on LGBTQ rights, on economic welfare, on use of recreational drugs and guns. So let's stop here and get back to this.